As we've explored HTML and XHTML and cascading style sheets, we've been a little loose and flexible with our usage of syntax. As we go forward, we'll begin to bring our syntax into compliance with the rules of XHTML. One of the first rules that we need to pay attention to are the rules that the web browser needs to understand to interpret your code. Document type definitions, or doc types as they're commonly referred to, are instructions that you provide to the viewer's web browser so that the web browser will understand precisely what version of HTML you intend to author so that that web browser can interpret your code properly. As we learned earlier, HTML, like all technologies, are moving targets. Tags come, tags go, rules change with time, leaving the web browser to have to struggle to understand what it is that you're trying to write from a code point of view. We'll take a look at a few commonly used doc types, but we should note that the doc type itself refers to a document type definition, referred to as a DTD, which are essentially a list of rules for a given version of HTML, which will then instruct the browser on how to display the code correctly. The two doc types that you'll most commonly encounter going forward will be XHTML 1.0 transitional, which we will use for all of our lessons going forward, and XHTML 1.0 strict. If we look at the syntax of XHTML 1.0 transitional here, we can see there are two components, two separate blocks of code that we need to pay attention to. The first block is actually one line. I've split that line up onto two lines to make it a little easier on your eye. You can see the syntax reads document type definition HTML public from the World Wide Web Consortium with the DTD of type XHTML 1.0 transitional and a fully qualified URL to the location of that DTD. We'll get into fully qualified URLs and local URLs in a later chapter, but for right now, just know that the document type is essentially instructing your browser to follow a set of rules and where it can go to look up those rules. That's why that link is specified there. It's never presented to the viewer. And notice that there is no closing tag. This block of code looks like an opening tag, but it's actually a comment. And we'll review exactly what comments are as we explore CSS. But for our purposes as a web designer, this is an instruction that you are defining, which is interpreted by the viewer's web browser. The second portion is a modification to the HTML tag. That modification coming in the form of an attribute. This is the only time you're going to see this attribute in XHTML. Earlier we discussed XHTML being the most current version of HTML, but that HTML conforming to the rules of another technology called XML. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. It is a markup language beyond the scope of this course, but because XHTML conforms to the rules of XML, XML requires us to define what in that scripting language is called a namespace. In XML, a namespace is a method for qualifying element and attribute names used in XML. Looking at these lines of code, they may look a little scary, a little intimidating, and a very large headache in waiting when looking at the prospect of having to put this into every page. I think it's safe to say in my entire career, never have I actually typed these lines of code, due to the near certainty of me making a mistake in doing so. Since these are standard items, requirements for creating valid XHTML, and we'll discuss validation in a later chapter, simply copy and paste these blocks of code into future HTML files that you create. And I'm using the acronyms HTML and XHTML interchangeably. When I refer to HTML going forward, I really mean XHTML. And that's not just me in the way that I speak. Everybody you encounter is going to refer to their XHTML code as HTML, and they'll qualify their code with a doc type. As an aside, in addition to the doc type definition being a rule passed to the web browser, it's a hint to you so that you know how the HTML code that you might inherit when you take a new job and receive a new website to maintain, how that code was intended to be written. XHTML 1.0 strict is nearly an identical doc type to that of XHTML 1.0 transitional, the main difference being that in XHTML 1.0 strict, older, non-supported tags, such as the font tag, which we've not looked at intentionally, are no longer supported. And what no longer supported means is that they don't qualify as valid code. The web browser may display them properly, but at a future time, 10 years from now, the web browser may not, because new standards, such as those that you're learning now, are replacing older tags in older versions of HTML.